I just want to offer a couple of notes of welcome and thank you for joining this book salon. I'm Stef Schuster. I'm an assistant professor at Michigan State University. Before we begin, I just want to offer a thank you to the SWS Book Salon Committee for selecting the books, organizing most of this. It's made, as a moderator, my job very easy. Today, I'm going to begin by introducing the authors in the order that we'll hear them kind of present their work. Then we'll turn to a pre-selected questions that each author has had access to. And then we want to make sure that we have time at the end for audience members to ask questions of the authors as well. So if you just give me 1 second, screen sharing always takes me just a moment, so hold on. All right, let's see. And I also so rarely teach with PowerPoint anymore that it takes a while to get recalibrated. Can everyone see that okay? Yeah, okay. So the first author that we will be learning about her work is Elizabeth Rahilly, who is an assistant professor of sociology at Georgia Southern University. Her research and teaching interests concern gender, sexuality, LGBTQ studies, and qualitative research methods. She also teaches courses on theory and education. Her current research project regards parents who practice gender open parenting. This includes parents who do not disclose the assigned sex of their children, who use they, them, their pronouns for the child from birth until the child expresses their own sense of gender. The next author will be Baker Rogers, an associate professor of sociology at Georgia Southern University. Their research focuses on inequality, specifically examining the intersections of gender, sexuality, and religion in the US South. Their book, Conditionally Accepted, Christians' Perspectives on Sexuality and Gay and Lesbian Civil Rights, was released with Rutgers University Press in December of 2019. And their book, Trans Men in the South, Becoming Men, was released with Lexington Books in January of 2020. Their new book, King of Hearts, Drag Kings in the American South, will be released in October of 2021. Their work is also published in journals such as Men and Masculinities, the Journal of Interpersonal Violence, Gender and Society, Qualitative Sociology, Sociological Inquiry, the International Journal of Transgenderism, Sexualities, Review of Religious Research, International Journal of Social Research Methodology, and Feminist Teacher. The third author, Miriam Abelson, sorry, and I'm looking over because I have like a different computer. Sorry if that's awkward. Miriam Abelson is an associate professor of women, gender, and sexuality studies at Portland State University. She received her doctorate degree in sociology from the University of Oregon. Her research focuses on the intersections of race, sexuality, and gender in rural and urban spaces, masculinities, and queer and transgender studies. Her ongoing projects investigate rural LGBTQ lives and right-wing movements in the US Northwest, queer and trans youth coming of age experiences, and marginalized people's access to urban public transit. Her book, Men in Place, Trans Masculinity, Race and Sexuality in America, was published in 2019. And I will put all of those different links and discount codes into the chat in just a second. So the arrangement of our time together in the book salon will begin first by hearing from each author, who will present about 7 minutes for their discussion of their books. Then we'll turn to the prearranged questions and then conclude with the audience Q&A. For the authors, I do have a 1-minute heads up, and also time is up. So I will be keeping track just so that we make sure that we have enough time for audience members to ask questions. And the order that we'll go in will be Elizabeth, Baker, and then Miriam. So Elizabeth, whenever you're ready.
And Steph, we're answering all 4 right now, correct? Okay. So what is my book about? My book is about a new generation of parents. Thank you, by the way, Steph, for those introductions, and I'm excited to be here with everyone. My book is about a new generation of parents who identify and raise and support a young child as transgender from relatively early on in the life course. And it's important to recognize at the outset that the parents in the book certainly don't represent the first instances we've ever seen of childhood gender nonconformity or of embracing that nonconformity, including reading it as something trans. But they do represent something radically new happening in their own historical moments in terms of the way in which they are making the category trans available and viable and possible for a very young child. Specifically, the book draws on interviews with 55 parents who speak to 43 cases of childhood gender nonconformity altogether, conducted between 2009 and 2015. And I should say that 13 of those cases function as longitudinal vignettes or portraits in the book. That is, parents and families I formally interviewed and followed up with twice, several years apart. I also interviewed 9 professionals for the project. And at the heart of the stories the book examines are how parents make sense of their children's expressions, including as transgender, how they made sense of their children's bodies in that, their consideration for non-binary gender possibilities, as well as medical options for their children. But what I ultimately argue is that parents' approaches in these ways are not only, if at all, actually an outgrowth of what we might see as broadening LGBTQ advocacy or paradigms. Rather, they are a product of a particularly child-rooted, child-intensive, child-centered model of 21st century paradigm. And as I argue, those two scaffolds were actually not always in sync with each other. In some ways, parents subtly had to resist or challenge LGBTQ paradigms they felt to support their child. And I argue that those child-intensive modes, coupled with a legacy of feminist parenting, actually serve as the social mechanism through which childhood transgender possibilities are being realized and facilitated by contemporary parents. As far as how the book relates to gender and gender theory and gender scholarship, first of all, I think these parents and families are part of a bigger cultural trend and ideological shift that sees non-conforming sensibilities or atypical expressions as something about gender and one's relationship to the gender binary, and not about sexuality or sexual orientation in ways that some of these expressions and cases may have been previously understood. And I know that that's not necessarily a new thing. You know, for example, Baker, you talk about in your book how many of your interviewees first lived their lives as gay or lesbian and then came to understand themselves as trans. So we've certainly seen that before in the individual biographic narrative, but I do think there's a broader cultural ideological shift happening where the grid of interpretation, the grid of understanding is gender and the gender binary and not sexuality. And I argue that these parents are actually at the center of that shift. I don't think that they're just doing descriptive labor between distinguishing these two things. I argue they're doing quite generative, productive labor about what can count as gender variance in the first place in very important ways. I also think the book's discussion around non-binary identity is important for scholarship, gender scholarship right now. I think as we're all recognizing, non-binary identities are gaining traction and visibility, importantly so, both in the academe and academic theorizing, but also in terms of LGBTQ politics at large. And many of the parents I interviewed were frankly giddy and excited to think about the non-binary, to deconstruct the boxes altogether for their kids. However, oftentimes the children were not expressing themselves in these ways. In fact, the children were often adamantly binary identified, pink and blue, stereotypical boys and girls. And for many of these parents, non-binary actually functioned as kind of a crutch to avoid going all the way, as they often put it to me, than anything authentic of the young children's expressions. And so while I think there is a growing call to include the voices of trans youth and trans kids in this research, which is absolutely paramount, I think it's also important to recognize very stark cohort differences between the way this is looking in the early childhood context and how parents are trying to wrap their minds around this versus wider trans youth and LGBTQ youth discourses that are circulating at large. And I think I've forgotten the question. Oh, intersections. As far as intersections, I'd like to talk about the demographics of the sample. Most of the parents, the majority of the parents could be classified as middle to upper middle class parents, college educated, and white identified. 80% of parents identified as white, and 70+% of households were firmly in the middle to upper middle class and college educated. And while these parents certainly don't represent the only kind of parent that might support a child as trans, it was important to reflect on those intersections in the book. Namely how their relative socioeconomic privilege might assist the ways in which they could so intensively advocate on behalf of their children, let alone vis-a-vis major institutions and authorities like doctors' offices who've never heard of hormone blockers. And so that was important to reflect on. And towards the end of the book, I actually argue that their structural positions deeply influenced their very biomedical, ideological perspectives they took on. Lastly, as far as feminist praxis, I had several responses to this question I wanted to talk about, and then I attended a book salon last night and listened to very different responses to the question that really made me think about some of my own other aspects of feminist praxis that I talk about in the appendix, and really the challenges, in some ways, conundrums of feminist praxis. And in this work, that really was about my advocacy for these parents and what the parents are doing was not always in sync with how I would advocate for trans kids and trans youth. And there's a pressure, as one author put it last night, there is a pressure to get the story right, especially when the stakes are so high for researching potentially marginalized communities. But there were some instances where the parents' perspectives I was more critical of, and not what I would necessarily advocate for trans kids. And how am I an advocate to the parents and respecting them, let alone as a non-parent, versus how would I advocate for trans youth? And we can talk more about that, but I will close there.
Great, thank you so much. So, and I went ahead and put the questions in the chat just so that the audience can kind of follow through the different points that you're addressing in a, I understand it's like a concise manner. So Baker, would you like to share a little bit about what your book is about and kind of go through the questions as well?
Thanks, Steph. So what is my book about? I think out of the three books, my book, at least to me, feels more like an introduction to a lot of topics, a lot of different ways that we need to go, kind of like these are all areas. So one of the questions that we're going to talk about later that Steph is going to pose about how do I think this research can be carried forward? I think my book, each chapter could be carried forward into whole books by different people, not by me. I'm not going to write that many books, so someone please do that. But I think mine had less of a focus on necessarily fully developing theory, but giving introductions to different issues. So it was introductions to different issues that trans men in the South deal with. So all of my research is based around gender and sexuality, in this case, focused on gender, and how that intersects in the South, because I feel like this is a region that's been overlooked and there's so much happening here. And it's so different from other areas. When I hear things, I'm just like, that's not how I experienced it at all. So that's what my whole research agenda is about, and what this book particularly was about, focusing on interviews with 51 trans men across the region. Each chapter, like I said, is kind of an introduction to coming out, to trans manhood, to narratives of being born in the wrong body and discovery narratives, to passing and whether passing is the right word or what that means, what that looks like. A chapter about religion, because you can't really talk about the South without religion, no matter whether you're religious or not. A chapter addressing discord within the queer community and like the whole debate over does the T fit in the LGBTQ community and how trans people are accepted within the queer community. And then a chapter on sexual harassment and assault. So I'm happy to talk about any of those specific chapters when we go into the Q&A, but that's kind of just an overview of what the book is about, a bunch of different topics and how those are experienced, particularly by people who identify as trans men in the South. Obviously, the book connects to gender and gender theory. It's all about gender. It's all about particularly trans masculine people, most of whom identified as trans men or men, not using the trans label, but all of whom identified as trans masculine in some way. I use a lot of different gender theories because, like I said, it's kind of an introduction. So I kind of touch on different theories in different chapters. For example, in chapter 2 on trans manhood, I try to expand a lot of the the masculinities theories, which I also try to do with my piece in Men and Masculinities. I touch on queer theories. I take an intersectional perspective and use feminist and intersectional theories, and then obviously also expanding trans studies, whether that's necessarily a theory or a body of work in different ways. The intersections the book focus on, the demographics, it's like Elizabeth was saying, you could take these questions so many different ways. So demographically, it's very white sample, but I did have more racial diversity than a lot of studies in the South have found. So a little bit of racial diversity, but the way I took this question about intersections is more about how that trans masculine identity and experience intersected with characteristics like their the men's sexuality, race, their location, and particularly region, and then also with institutions like religion, family, healthcare, lots of different institutions that the men spoke about. So I'm happy to talk more about the demographics of the men in the book, or more about these different institutions and other characteristics that they intersect with. And then the last question about feminist praxis, I hope I tried to make sure that the whole project from start to finish was informed by feminist praxis. The very first part of this book, and what I have become a big proponent for in feminist work, is that we have to locate ourselves. I know most feminists are, that's not unique, but I'm trying to teach my students that importance of locating ourselves in our work. And I think that's why I started this book with that. So I talk about myself. I start with a quote, as a queer Southern feminist sociologist, obviously this list could go on. I approached this project from a position within the Southern trans community, which is different from a lot of people who have studied the trans community. I see myself as an outsider within. I don't identify as a trans man, but I identify as genderqueer, and I identify as Southern. So an outsider within this queer trans community. And I feel like that my personal connections and my understanding of the South and the culture of the South really allowed me to gain specific access that maybe wouldn't be available to everyone, since I am in some ways an insider, and other ways at least connected to people in my study. I also lay out in my introduction just why I think it's so important that I allow the interviews and the trans men's words to speak for themselves. Obviously that's hard, like Elizabeth was saying, when we don't necessarily agree. There's a lot of things that I thought I would agree with, because these were all trans men in the South, and that's, these are my people, and I disagreed with way more than I agreed with for most of them. So to try to make sure to put it in their words and not critiquing their words while at the same time theorizing about it, right? So not critiquing the parents in Elizabeth's books while at the same time saying, this might not be the best way to handle our children, but also this is what you said. And so I tried really hard to be true to what the men said and show why that was good and why that was bad. And also I think that feminist praxis is important, because we go in with our theoretical perspectives and expecting to find something, then we can limit, we put our blinders on. And so by allowing the trans men to speak for themselves and tell me things, they told me a lot of things that I never thought about or knew about. So I think that's another important part of feminist praxis. And then the last thing I'll say, this is a quote from Lombardi's research. They say that social research is dominated by cis narratives of trans people and trans lives. The dominance of cis voices in explaining the trans experience continues to limit what we know. So that was one of the pieces in this book. And the reason I covered so many topics is because I wanted us to have some trans voices on each of these topics to give us a starting point and stop limiting what we know from cis perspectives. So I'll stop there. And like I said, I'm happy to answer questions about any of that after Miriam.
Okay, Great. Thank you so much, Baker. For folks who came in a little late, I will be putting the links to these different books into the chat in a couple of minutes. And also, each author has offered the discount code to encourage everyone to pick up their books. But before we get there, Miriam.
Thanks, Steph. And, you know, just want to say a quick thank you to the other panelists. It's great to be on this with you, and the folks who organize these sessions, and Barrett and others that are organizing this. Really like the best virtual conference I've been to for sure. So thank you. So my book, Men in Place, really focuses on answering the question of what does it mean to be a man in the United States in the early 21st century? And I looked at this question through interviews with 66 trans men who are living across urban, rural, and suburban locations in the US South, in the Midwest, and in the West. And what I show in the book, my main argument is that contemporary masculinities and what it means to be a man are really shaped by these spaces such as region, urban, rural location, and settings like family and public bathrooms that folks move through in their everyday lives. The understanding of masculinity, of race and sexuality and context at the heart of Men in Place, I think allows us to better see how social inequality persists in various contexts. At the same time that we see some, you know, perhaps uneven changes to gender and race relations writ large. So in most spaces and places, but certainly not all, I found that the most common model or ideal for masculinity that emerged from interviews, narratives, was what I refer to as a Goldilocks masculinity. So this is an in-between masculinity that is not too masculine and not too feminine or effeminate. So those that perform it successfully are individuals that can maintain this in-between, is that they encounter the social expectations of different contexts. So I think one of the key insights of the book is moving beyond an idea of like, what is this man's masculinity or what is this group of men's masculinity, but instead shifting to thinking about how do men and how do we all shift our masculinities, our gender, et cetera, as we move between these different contexts. So this change, this Goldilocks masculinity, I think offers some promise, and it in that like these ways of being masculine are less violent and less dominating, right? It's sort of against that, this sort of hypermasculinity. But I show that this new ideal of this in-between masculinity is perhaps only a surface change rather than a substantive change to masculinities. And particularly, I think the question of the underlying inequities of gender, race, and sexuality. So one of the keys here is I find that maintaining those social hierarchies happens through an emphasis on who can control themselves and who cannot. So here, by control, I don't mean inflexibility, right? When we think of like a controlling masculinity, but rather this idea that this ability to maintain an in-between when moving in and out of the expectations of different situations and particular spaces. So the people that can control themselves, this ideal of masculinity, are regular guys. This often stands in for a sort of straight, white, middle class values masculinity. And those are the folks that can find that Goldilocks sweet spot. At the same time, that Goldilocks middle is constructed in opposition to these hypermasculinities of white, rural, poor men, urban, Black, poor men on one end, and then on the other end, more feminized versions, feminized men, gay men, women who can't properly control themselves, right? So it's sort of finding this in between in this gendered, racialized, sexualized opposition. So in the book, I look at a range of processes. I look at how recognition works as a social process to like even create the category of man, how embodiment and emotion are central to masculinity. I look at spatial mappings of fear and safety, how narratives of vulnerability to violence can produce a sense of innocence and complacency, right, in systems of inequality. I also look at how narratives of fear and experiences of violence operate in public bathrooms and medical contexts, or what I call amplified sites of gender and sexuality. So I think this book offers insight into contemporary masculinities, but also some key theoretical tools to better understand the intersection of race, sexuality, and gender in everyday life, right? Particularly in relation to space and place. So that's, that's a chunk of what the book is about. In terms of gender theory, I'm really thinking a lot at the interactional level in this book, right? So building on the Doing Gender tradition, where I suggest that we pay, again, more attention to the context where interactions happen, and how interactions shift between context. I also engage with critical masculinity studies, pushing against the often cisgender and essentialist bias of the field, to show that, this sort of simple thing to me, that trans men are men as much as anyone else is a man, right? And I think the book speaks also clearly to debates about Connell's hegemonic masculinity, and lends evidence in line with, C.J. Pascoe and Tristan Bridges, that we're, really seeing the emergence, these newer masculinities are hybrid masculinities, right? They're, again, that sort of surface rather than substantive change to gender relations. Thanks. Let's see. So I'll just say that intersections of race, sexuality, and gender are really central to the book, and building on, Black feminist approaches to intersectionality, building on various women of color and queer of color traditions of looking at those intersections as deeply intertwined was really central, both like to my intersectional approach, but also the feminist praxis of the book, right? So not treating intersectionality as this sort of one word that means one thing, but gaining some depth into those perspectives. And I think that also my feminist practice was really important in those issues of representation that I think have come up for Baker and Elizabeth as well, and navigating those. And I can talk more about those later, but I'll go ahead and stop there.
Great, thank you. I know I would imagine that answering in 7 minutes and going through these, large questions about what is your book about and how does gender theory inform it, and we have plenty of time to kind of continue working our way through some of these questions. I went ahead and put the links into the chat so folks can easily access your work. Let's shift a little bit to some of the other questions. I think that these will provoke really interesting, lively conversations. So one question, and maybe this is just from teaching, I like having things in the chat. So one question is if each of you could maybe take a little bit of time to tell us about some of the decisions that you had to make regarding methods, and also how your lens as a feminist sociologist guided any of the decisions that you made. So just kind of open it up to anyone who wants to come into the question.
Sorry, Baker, did you want to go? Okay. One thing I'll say is, again, the voices of the children and censoring the voices of the children in this kind of burgeoning subfield of analysis is so important. However, I made the very, I feel, critical decision not to interview the children. First of all, that a child would depart from the expectations of their assigned sex is not really sociologically interesting, or what I was interested in. It's how the parents and the rest of the milieu responds and makes sense of this. But moreover, as a cisgender, gender-conforming presenting interviewer, I did not feel that would be a safe space, potentially, for a young child. And I think that people who do interview young children, let alone about their nonconformities, I think that requires a very special, in some ways, training and approach. And so I never actually sought IRB approval to interview the children. This really was a study about the parents. And, speaking of feminist praxis and how I navigated that, Baker, you talked a lot about these different ways in which you felt inside and outside your community. And, you know, in many ways, I felt like an outsider on several key fronts. I'm not trans, I'm visibly gender conforming presenting, but more importantly, I would argue I'm not a parent. And so one part of my feminist praxis and approach was, you know, remember the parents are the experts of parenting in these interviews, you know, and letting those, you know, I fully regarded myself as clueless about parenting in some ways. And I forgot the other point I wanted to make, so I'm just going to pause there.
And you know, I just want to build on some of those points that you know, I talk about this in my methodological appendix, I think, but you know, the real when I was thinking about issues of positionality and reciprocity throughout the research process, which often gave me, you know, questions about should I be doing, because of various insider and outsider, or other kinds of ways of thinking about my own status in relation to the interviewees. You know, is thinking about like, am I the person to do this research, right? Am I the one to, like, am I the right person to do it? Which I still don't have a definitive answer on. But one of the things that stood out to me in the process was how unexpected the connections and disconnections were between myself and some of the people I was interviewing, and really how transformative the process of doing this research over, you know, I think I did these interviews over about 4 or 5 years. And I talk in the book about, you know, people would say, oh, you're this person from Oregon. You know, I just wanted to see, what is this person from Oregon doing in the South or the Midwest? And in my head, I would think, I'm a person from California. You know, I just moved to Oregon. Now that I've lived in Oregon, you know, a dozen years, I feel a little bit more, you know, like that. But you know, I sort of transformed into this person from Oregon, right? So I think that's one key thing. And in terms of representation, I think one of the key sort of feminist elements of the work is getting that representation of trans voices out there. But what was crucial for me, and especially Baker mentioned that, like, when people say these, you know, things you really don't agree with, or you maybe find kind of awful, or, you know, which was not the majority of the folks I talked to, but the ability to put them in conversation with one another, right? You know, I'm still the author or the researcher doing that conversation, but when someone would say something, you know, that I found like objectionable in whatever way, I often had another interviewee that was talking about that very thing, right? So I could put those two folks in conversation with each other, which I think is, you know, was able to take me beyond like individual representation and more about like what kinds of conversations are happening socially and politically among trans men and in trans communities.
I just want to make just a couple, I mean, I think my methods were pretty straightforward. I mean, choosing qualitative methods, I think is important for this work. I mean, I'm a qualitative methodologist, and I see the value in all types of methods, but for this work, I think we're still at the beginning, and we need to hear voices more than we need numbers. The numbers are important, but they're not telling the story that we need to learn at this point. So that's why I chose interviews. I did phone interviews, I mean, some for convenience, but more so because I wanted to hear not just people in South Carolina or North Carolina, but also in Arkansas. And so I could get the full range of what I considered in this book to be the Southeastern region. And also it gives some confidentiality and some ability to, it's like some people chose not to tell me where they lived because they were afraid, because they'd been harassed before. So the phone interviews were really important for safety and those reasons that some people did not feel comfortable meeting or telling me even where they lived. I mean, not even like the city. I didn't ask their address. They wouldn't even tell me the city they lived. And then in regards to methods, I guess the main thing I want to say is that I highly recommend Queer Methods. The other, please specify Queer Methods in Sociology. If you haven't read it and you're a queer methodologist, if you're doing anything with gender, sexuality, or qualitative methods, please read it. And yes, Tina's in there. I see her little clapping hands on here. Tina's work's in there. A lot of awesome works are in there. I really took a lot from my methodology from that book, from Kat Connell's work and Jane Ward's works specifically. And I think reading the methodologies in Miriam and Elizabeth's books, you did also. So I think reading that book and hopefully if you do use these codes to purchase our books, our methodology appendixes show how we did those queer methods. So if you're a methodologist, I think the appendix might be kind of interesting, but putting them in conversation with other, please specify, because those are some great pieces that move feminist methodology, but specifically queer feminist methodology forward in ways that it hadn't been before. And I also wrote a methods piece that kind of compared my methods from studying Mississippi Christians and trans men in the same region of the country and comparing those, and how I had, unfortunately, some similar experiences that I weren't expecting. For example, studying trans men in the South, only 1 out of 51 trans men asked me my own pronouns. Most use she automatically without asking me. So I think those are interesting points about methodology, and I have a piece in a methodology journal that I can't think of the name of right now. But if you're interested, I could send that. And I think that, along with Compton, I think it's Compton Shilton Meadow, right? Book. So maybe Steph can put that link in there too. I think that's a really good thing for thinking through methodology.
Yeah, absolutely. I can definitely do that. So I sort of modified this question on the fly. I hope that's okay with the authors. But I added, I guess, a little bit of a twist to it. So for folks who have not yet had the occasion to write a book, writing a book can be both exciting and challenging. So if you could maybe reflect on what practices helped you complete this work, and then the twist is, what challenges did you experience, and also what joys in writing your work?
So many joys and challenges. You know, I'll start off with, you know, I think there's some internal challenges around, you know, like not feeling like I was a person that was going to write a book, right? And so I think that it's key to, you know, get over some of those challenges. And for me, that was really talking to people that I knew that had written books. And as I became more familiar with the process, I really thrive on sort of being told that, you know, I shouldn't do something. And so I think looking at like the institutional constraints of being in a sort of quasi research and teaching institution, there was a lot more encouragement for to focus on articles rather than on books, just because of the support of the institution. And that, you know, at the moment, at least, really lit a fire under me, like, I'm going to do this, right? I'm going to contradict you all. Not that folks weren't supportive of me doing it. In terms of like really practical tips, for me, it was, you know, there's always so much more going on that feels immediate than a book project, even if it is tied to, you know, promotion or getting a job or whatever else. So just a very basic thing of trying to make real deadlines that feel real. So I would do something like ask someone to read a chapter, set a date for it, and pretend that was absolutely a hard deadline, right? If I didn't send this chapter to Steph, they're never going to speak to me again, right? And that helped me, you know, get things out and get things moving along. I'll also say that, particularly for folks that are, you know, at somewhat under-resourced institutions like PSU, we don't get a lot of support for a ton of research support. We get some, but we're really lucky to have a writing support program. We have a wonderful faculty in our College of Education that does, you know, she's an expert in academic writing, and they organize weekly accountability groups among faculty from different departments. And so I've participated in those from the time I started at my institution. And then they offer weekly, or excuse me, like 1 day during the term and week-long during the summer writing retreats. And these are just, you're in a room, there's, you know, things to plug in your laptops or whatever, and they offer like the bare minimum of university catering, so it's like a sad sandwich platter, but it's such a wonderful space. It's a quiet space to feel, to focus and really get a chunk of work done. And, you know, I think that that's a concrete thing if anyone's looking for creating institutional supports for people writing books, or just getting their writing done in general. I think that's a really wonderful thing that I was able to take advantage of.
Let's see. So what practices helped me complete the book? I would say first, and maybe most importantly, don't write a book about something you're not passionate about, because it is a very long process. And especially if you're turning your dissertation into a book, you will likely really hate your dissertation by the time it becomes a book. So really care about it. So passion would be the most important thing to finishing a book project, in my opinion. And also having a conviction, I guess, that the research you're publishing is worth it, is needed, is important, because otherwise there's a lot of times you would just probably give up if you didn't think it was going to help in some way. The other thing that was really helpful to completing the project was helpful in encouraging editors. There are some really great editors, and there are some that are really hard to work with, just like any other thing. So find an editor who's excited about your project, just as excited or more excited about your project than you are. I've worked with some editors who are not, and I've sent in many revisions of copies of things and finally just went to another editor, and then all of a sudden they loved it exactly as it was, and we picked up from there. So I think with journals and books, if someone's not excited about it, you will find someone who is excited about it. Just you gotta have to find them. So I try not to, we're all going to deal with the rejections. That's the part of those challenges, right? But take that rejection for someone didn't like it, you don't like some things, and send it to someone else until you find someone who's ready to work with you. That doesn't mean they're going to tell you it's perfect, because that's not helpful, but that means that they're going to be encouraging. The last book I worked on with Rutgers on drag kings, my editor, I think, is more excited about the book than I am. So like she was super excited, kept sending me ideas and stuff, and like that was really encouraging to help me keep going. Challenges, I think, I don't know, I actually really like writing books. I mean, obviously there's challenges, like Miriam said, you have to set your own deadlines. It's very different than like if you're writing for a special issue of a journal, there's a deadline, or if you know you need 3 articles published by tenure, there's a deadline. But books, you have to set your own deadline, so that's definitely a challenge. And then with this particular book, I didn't read the contract very well, and it came out in hard copy, and it's so expensive, and that's a challenge because students can't afford it. And hopefully in the summer, if I sell enough copies, I'll put it in paperback, but I don't know how to sell enough copies when the book's $90 a pop. So making sure you're reading those contracts and thinking about what you want to do with the book. If you want it to be used in classes, you need to publish with a press that students can afford. Yes, you can ask your libraries to purchase them. That's great. Please, everyone, ask your library to purchase all these books to support the authors. But for all students to have copies is just when they're $90 versus Miriam's and Elizabeth's are way cheaper because they came out in paperback first thing, right? Way less expensive. Cheap is a bad word, right? They're way less expensive. And so, thanks, Sal. So that I guess is the challenge, is it's just making sure you're thinking about what you want to do, where you want to do it. The good thing about my book, it took me way less time to publish it than any other book, and probably way less than it took Elizabeth and Miriam, because Lexington is not an academic press. They publish academic books, but they're not with a university. So Rutgers University Press takes way longer than Lexington. I wrote this book start to finish and published it in like a year. So there's pros and cons to it being $90, because if I needed it for 10 years. So thinking through all those when we're not really taught that in grad school is a challenge. So like Miriam said, talk to people who have done it. And then the joy is just holding the book in your hands when they print it. It feels I have a baby now, so I did say it felt like, having a baby. It's not quite that good, but it's pretty close. So holding that paper, that book in your hands is a really good joy of publishing books. So I'll stop there.
Well, one key practice that I adopted was caffeinating. That was very important to writing a book. But on a more serious note, speaking candidly, the bulk of this book was written when I was still on the job market. And a permanent home, a permanent academic home, was not necessarily a sure thing. And so I came to realize I owe these parents the telling of their rich stories and perspectives that they gave me all of the time, all of those years to share. And so the major motivator of getting this book written was in large part for the parents and who care about the stories, because those stories are so important to how they legitimize these identities for their children, especially at the time. I think we're talking about these books, especially from the childhood perspective. The trans child is so much more crystallized in institutional and cultural consciousness than when a lot of these parents were first embarking on these journeys. And so for me, it was, I didn't want these stories to kind of disappear into the annals of the job market, if you will. And especially the first substantive chapter was really written for them, probably more than an academic audience. In some ways, it was a data dump, if you will, of all of the rich stories and experiences they had that came to constitute a transgender profile for their kid. Because at the end of the day, that's all they had to make this real and viable. So doing justice to their stories was a huge motivator in publishing their book. The challenge, as we've actually already kind of touched on, is when do I honor the parents and when do I dare to be more critical? And what guided some of my ultimate decisions on that front is, again, the trans child and what I want for a trans child growing up in the world today. And so that trumped sometimes my regard for the parents' perspectives. And I just want to say, I think that understandably we can be very critical of trans-normative, overly biomedicalized perspectives. But a parent who is routinely hearing from a child, why did God make a mistake? Why don't I have this? When will this grow in? As a non-parent, I needed to be very delicate about how those conversations were handled. And to a young child, parents' biomedical perspectives could be very validating. So those were some of the challenges, right? Because their perspectives butt up against everything we try to deconstruct as gender sociologists in ways I didn't expect. And yet I am a non-parent and I need to be incredibly cautious about how they were doing this in the service of protecting and affirming their children.
Great, thank you. Each of you has already kind of touched on this question, but I want to just put it out into the space if you have additional ideas as far as who some of the audiences are for the book, and just from a teaching perspective, how you see them, like using the work in their subfields, courses, training for future, like, I don't know, however you want to answer the question. Yeah.
Well, I mentioned that I think my book in particular, because it's kind of introductions to different issues, I think a lot of people in the field could use this in their subfield. So if you're teaching about sexual violence, there's a chapter on that. If you're teaching about religion, there's a chapter on that. And so I think using the various chapters rather than the whole book could be a good way to introduce different and specifically trans and queer perspectives to a lot of different topics that we cover in sociology. So I hope that maybe some of these chapters can add trans voices to topics that often are like religion, that often come from only cis people's perspectives.
Do either of you want to jump into the question? Miriam's like, no.
Well, I think I already mentioned, I do care that other parents might read this book, parents who are experiencing this. And, sometimes we get the feedback that, academic books may not serve a lay audience, but I also think maybe we underestimate sometimes lay readers' willingness and eagerness to engage with more what we might call complicated or academic or abstract perspectives. I know the parents I interviewed read the manuscript and had, replied to me and had thoughts about it and were so ready to engage, both in the interview and in the writing and the aftermath. So I care that this might reach beyond the academe. I certainly think it's relevant to gender studies scholars, especially those working in the field of LGBTQ youth, and they can observe some of those important cohort differences and what that means for trans identity as we know it, frankly. I think that's really important. Family and childhood socialization scholars. These parents are certainly shaking up what gender identity development can look like in childhood. And I also think as far as students, I tried to group the analysis around 3 broad areas that I consider central to sociological and social constructionist paradigms on gender. And that is gender and sexuality, or gender versus sexuality, the gender binary itself, male, female, masculine, feminine, and stuff in between, and the body. And I think that can be a very approachable way for undergraduates to examine some of this material. And lastly, social workers and therapists who are working with trans children who sometimes may not have the most expansive frameworks, frankly. And I hope that my book can push them to think about those in a way some of my own parents I interviewed raised those concerns in the book.
I just wanted to briefly add that I hope that my book can also be used to challenge or at least complicate the narrative of the Southeastern United States. I think, especially for people teaching outside of the Southeastern United States, where people didn't come from there and don't know the nuance of how gender and sexuality is treated there, I hope that this can be part of that as well. I'm working on a chapter for a book right now about Appalachia, about trans people and queerness in Appalachia, and like these limited narratives of the South and Appalachia and stuff. Really, we need to continue to challenge those.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. And in terms of my book, I know that people have used the book in sociology of gender courses and masculinities, courses that are focusing on intersectional perspectives, so inequalities, race, class, and gender, trans studies. And then, in terms of more interdisciplinary fields, American studies, geography for sure, which really took learning a lot of the sort of lingo and perspectives of that sort of parallel field to sociology. And in terms of, I set out to really write an academic book, and, and that those questions of like, sort of who is it for, and that, I'm okay with that. I tried to make it a clearly written academic book, right? But one of the reasons I started this research, which was actually as an undergraduate in sociology, was that, a lot of the material that I saw written about trans people didn't really reflect the lives of the trans people that were in my communities. And so, in a careful and I hope reflective way, one of the goals was to have something that if someone was willing to engage with that academic work, that they might, see a different form of representation. And that really affected a lot of my choices throughout the research process, writing, selecting a press to work with, was finding people that would be sensitive to that, right? That wouldn't just say, oh, this is a trans topic, this is exciting, in that sort of voyeuristic way, but would really, be part of doing something different. And, it's been heartening, and I'm always, sure there are people out there that maybe read the book and hate it, but hopefully not too many. But most of the people that have talked to me, trans men or trans masculine people, including some of the ones I interviewed, have come to me and said that they see themselves in the book, for the most part, but also like feel challenged by it as men and as masculine people. And to me, that really, like as sort of a provocation for all of us to do better, to be better, right? As sort of like people that take on masculinity. And so to me, that's really such a good sign that I did some things right there, right? In terms of who I wanted to reach.
And then I just have to say that resonates a little bit with me, Miriam, because I do think the books are, you know, not just a finished product, but an opening to a conversation sometimes with our very participants. And I do think some parents maybe had some defensive responses to some of the frameworks I critiqued, but also couldn't help but, you know, reconsider them and what does this mean? And I do, that resonates with me very much about what the books can do with our own participants. And maybe that's part of our feminist praxis, to engage them in a, you know, multifaceted, bi-directional conversation.
So this is I promise, I'm sure that the audience, like people in the audience have lots of questions they want to ask. This is the last question, like the last formally arranged question. So you've all had a little time since your book has come out, and I'm wondering if you can reflect and kind of think with us, looking back at what you've accomplished with this work. If you were advising a graduate student or maybe a colleague, how would you advise them to build on some of the contributions of your work? One book cannot do all the things, even if maybe we want them to. So what are some of the gaps that remain, or areas that you think really warrant future inquiry that you weren't able to take up in this particular book?
I think that I tried to take up a lot, but not in a deep way. So like I mentioned already, I think I would tell a graduate student to find what topic in the book interests them and then build on that chapter, whether that be more data, more voices, more ideas, whether that be comparing to other regions or countries, or whether that be developing the theory more fully, because I took up so many issues, I wasn't able to fully develop theory for, you know, each issue, or fully discuss all the theory in one book because I didn't focus on one topic. So I think there's so many ways. I think that my book, along with Miriam's, could be used as starting points for further development of masculinity theories, which is vital. Before things changed at Men and Masculinities recently, I had a rejection because they couldn't find enough people to review my paper because it was about trans men. And that was not what they were looking for at Men and Masculinities. It was about men, and they couldn't find enough people to review it. So masculinities theory, obviously that changed. The paper ended up being published there after the new editors took over. They found easily enough people to edit it. But the point is that this was seen as something so far outside of Men and Masculinities, and it was a paper about men. So I would love to see more people developing masculinity theories with trans men or trans masculine or non-binary masculine people in mind. I would love to see queer theory developed further in a lot of ways around a lot of topics, with trans and non-binary people in mind, rather than just LGBT people, or really just LG people. And so I think developing theory, more data, more voices, and continuing to add. I think there's just so many ways that my book is just the very, very beginning of something that could be a full encyclopedia if grad students wanted to pick up different pieces of it and develop it further.
Yeah, and I mean, I echo some of those things. You know, in terms of, you know, pushing against, I think Baker naming that what I call like the cisgender and essentialist bias of Men and Masculinities, right? That it's like the exclusion of trans men and trans masculine people, and then also, right, the way that like men are conceptualized, which like at Men and Masculinities and other places is really shifting right now, which is great to see. So I would say, you know, if someone is focusing on like trans men or trans populations more largely, I would say focusing on geographic diversity, focusing on the diversity of their samples, particularly increasing the racial diversity and class diversity of folks that are part of our work, but doing so in really meaningful ways, that it's not just that we can only understand race with samples that have a large number of people of color, but that we continue to interrogate things like whiteness among our, you know, our white participants. And also that in terms of that question about men and masculinities, about shifting that field, one of the things I would really love to see is that, you know, a study of men or a study of masculinity won't, you know, it won't be seen that a diverse sample is achieved unless it includes trans men and trans masculine people, right? Again, not this like special group on the side, but as people that inhabit these categories. And I think everyone inhabits these categories in kind of, you know, in different ways. But I think that's one of the key things going forward. And also, and again, this is my, you know, influence in geography of really taking space and place into consideration. You know, and taking, so wherever they decide to, if they're doing a comparative geographic approach, or they're looking at a particular region, to really spend some time, you know, that's really valuable, but also to spend the time to really think about and investigate what is the cultural, historical, social, you know, background of this place, right? And really thinking about how that's affecting the social processes that are happening there.
I echo Miriam and Baker. One thing would be certainly diversifying the samples currently, especially in, you know, the trans kid arena, and diversifying the recruitment methods. You know, the arenas and the forums I went to where I knew I was going to find parents like this did not call a very diverse sample, and that's important to talk about and reflect on. And interestingly, while I made a very concrete decision not to continue this research in a longitudinal or follow-up capacity, in part because I think some of that research is motivated by the question of, will they really be trans when they're 20? You know, what is this going to look like? And that doesn't motivate me, and I think that's a very actually problematic approach. But I do think, frankly, that more longitudinal follow-up research is important to normalize and make visible the diverse pathways around these identities. And I think the parents actually do some really important intellectual work in the book to suggest that just because an endpoint here looks different than what it does now doesn't mean that this is any less real or important. So I think capturing those potential diverse pathways and journeys will be really important. And also attending to what I gestured before, is that what trans affirmative parenting looks like for a young child or prepubescent child versus trans adolescents, trans youth who can engage in more complex discourses and maybe agency and narratives around this, I think is really interesting and important.
All right, thank you so much. So we have lots of time. I think we have a little under 30 minutes. So we'll just open the floor to any questions or comments that folks want to offer. If you prefer, you can just put them in the chat. Or is there the hand raise function? I'm not sure. Yeah, so, and also for our authors, if you have questions for each other as well, this is a great opportunity, so.
Oh, everyone, good to see everyone. Thanks so much for a great panel. And I'm really excited about hearing these books discussed together as a salon, and actually just even the practice of doing a book salon instead of an individual book. Author meets critics kind of session. Here's a question I have for you that it's a methods question, right? And I think it applies to each of you, although Elizabeth, you said that you are not a parent and you were talking to parents, but in some ways perhaps you might be assumed to be, you know, or assumed to have you know, as a cisgender person talking to other cisgender people about trans kids or something, right? Assumed to be kind of an insider, right? So here's the methods question. I think it was Howie Becker that said, never argue with the members, right? Never, like when you're doing interviews and data collection, never argue with them, just sort of take the data in, you know, and then do your analytic work after that, right? But I remember when I was doing interviews with folks, you know, and my work was on Butch and Femme at the time. And so I felt a personal relationship to some of this stuff, that when they would respond to some of my questions, I felt like I was responding to them as a member more so than an academic, right? And so it felt like I had an opportunity to not question them or disagree with them, but prod a little bit more and kind of use that insider perspective as a way to work out more details of the data or something. And so along the same line as Tina was suggesting with regard to dishing about how some of this worked, I wonder if you had some of those kinds of experiences as well, right? Where you felt like you were able to use that connection or that sort of insider kind of status or presumed insider status in some way to do a probing kind of contact with them.
I'm just going to jump in quick because this was actually going to be one of my responses to the feminist praxis question, was that I often felt that I flexed the anti-Howie Becker approach. And it was, I'm not sure it's always the right approach, but there were moments in the interviews when I because I feel like our participants have a right to know how we're thinking about things and how we're going to analyze things. This idea that we just consume their stories and then go analyze it and or critique it in the background, that doesn't feel very feminist at all to me. So there were definitely moments in the interview where I dared to kind of push back, if you will, a little bit. And maybe not as a member, although I absolutely do think I had insider status with the actual interviewees I was speaking with. But I dared to kind of say, you know, you're making me think, how would you respond to someone who says, that's messed up, or what are you insinuating about this? Or I did try to flex that absolutely in the interview space, because I think as feminist researchers and as queer researchers, our participants have a right to hear how we're thinking about things and that we can dialogue or engage more dialogically and bidirectionally.
Yeah. And I think for me, it really depended on the interview, right? And what the interviewee was looking to get out of it, the situation. I think that some of the guys that I interviewed were really interested in like having a space to show some of their authority and show some of their experience. And so that was something that I could provide in various ways. And others were really interested in having, I think, more of a conversation, seeing what that sense membership in sort of queer and feminist communities in common, whether it was from like seeing each other around or just sort of sensing that connection. So I think there was more of that conversation, and those felt like better spaces to push back. When I was reading Baker's book, when people were talking about their different experiences, like accessing aspects of transition, I thought about how the way that I would gain as a non-trans identified gender nonconforming person, I would gain all of this expertise in certain things, in certain areas, like what were the like processes and procedures, who were providers, even though my interviews didn't really totally focus on that. And people would tell me things sometimes that were wrong, right? They would say, you can't get your birth certificate changed in this way. And I would think, oh, actually, I've talked to 3 other people that, you can, and they, and so what I would, depending on the interview, I would come back later and just say, oh, by the way, like I would send them a follow-up email or text and say, hey, by the way, here's this information. But again, like really trying to find that nuance, like what are they, thinking in terms of reciprocity, what are they looking to get out of the situation, out of doing the interview with me, in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of had a similar experience, and I comparing my study with Mississippi Christians to Southern trans men really brings up these questions, because with the Mississippi Christians, most of them assumed that I was like them in all ways, and even though I was in no way like them in a lot of ways, like, right, they assumed I was an insider, like you said. They might have assumed Elizabeth was a mother, or something, but they assumed I was Christian. They assumed I was straight. They assumed no matter what I looked like, they assumed I was like them. And I didn't want them to know I wasn't, because then they wouldn't tell me. And also I got trapped and like preached to often when they found out I wasn't like them. So I wanted them to tell me their thoughts, assuming that I agreed with them. And in both studies, they wanted me to agree with them. You go back through the transcripts, and at the end of every sentence, people say, "You know what I mean? You get what I'm saying?" Or "That's right." Or like they want you to agree with them. And sometimes the things they say are just so horrible, and they're like, "You know what I mean?" And you're like, you hear yourself on the interview saying yes, and you're like, "No, I don't know what you mean. That's horrible." So I think in a lot of ways I did that kind of step back, but then at other times, like Miriam was saying, like when one guy told me he couldn't find healthcare, and I knew that there was healthcare where he lived, like ethically, I could not intervene there. Like in my opinion, I told him that he could go to Planned Parenthood to get trans healthcare because he lived near one and he didn't even know that. So like at that point, that was something that I knew about, and I felt I needed to tell him. But for the most part, I agreed with a lot of things that I didn't agree with, just because I wanted them to keep talking. So kind of what you were saying is that we can probe them to keep talking. But I feel like if we also agree with them or try to have conversations, we can fall into, I believe it was Kat Connell's piece in Other Please Specify, the queer methods book I was talking about, that talks about assuming that other lesbians felt the way that they did led them to limit their questions. It might not have been Kat's piece, but I believe it was. Led them to limit their questions in a way that made them find what they thought they wanted to find, rather than at some point they realized they were finding what they wanted to find rather than the truth. So I think sometimes if we talk too much, we can push them to kind of create a narrative that aligns with our own narratives if we're part of the community. So yeah, I agree. And I think, you know, you as you believe the same thing in some ways, that it's this balance. I don't know how to say that other than you have to fill it out like Miriam says.
I mean, definitely the point that you're drawing in is Becker's point, right? Which is not to feed the outcome of your data or move it in the direction of your expectation rather than their the members' interests. I'm thinking more in terms of like Henry Rubin's book, where Rubin does this whole Foucauldian genealogy of trans work, and then all the interview the folks that were interviewed for that say, "Oh no, you know, my gender is essential. I was born this way," right? And so it's sort of like the sort of the inverse, right, of the sort of received academic wisdom, right? Yeah. Anyway, thank you for your answers. I really appreciate it.
I'm sorry, and I know we should move on to a new question, but I can't help but jump in. I could talk about these, you know, these methodological issues all day, because, you know, Miriam, what you said about it depends on the interview. You know, there was one interview I remember distinctly where I raised the question of hormone blockers to the parent, and it was very distressing to her. And basically, in some ways, there's like a critical window of opportunity at which point you administer blockers. And there's kind of this dominant paradigm in the parental advocacy community that, you know, not to do anything is making a decision. And so her child was approaching, or of this age. And I asked, I said, "Have you looked into blockers?" And it was very distressing for her. And, you know, she apologized, she got emotional, and she said, "You know, it's not your fault. It's just, no, that really scares me. I don't think I want to go there yet." And yet it was again, kind of, it wasn't my place to prescribe, you know, to prescribe this, but at the same rate, it might be important for someone to consider with a child of that age. And so that's just one thing that sticks out about, I decided not to raise that question directly again in light of that experience.
So we still have time for one or two more questions if folks want to pitch anything to the authors, or again, if you have questions for each other.
this is not, I don't know if it's really a question, but Elizabeth, we should talk about doing something with the idea of non-binary and bisexuality, of how bisexuality was viewed the same way in some ways as non-binary, is that I don't want to go all the way. They don't want to go all the way, that middle step when people are really, they're really just gay. And that's kind of what some of your participants were saying, is they're really just trans, but this is like a very safe middle ground in case they change their mind. I think there's something interesting there that you didn't touch on a lot, but kind of goes along with all your stuff about gender versus sexuality, how non-binary is being used as this escape category, which making it not valid for people who are actually non-binary, the way people who are actually bisexual are seen as non-valid, because they're just on their way to being either gay or maybe they're just experimenting. So I don't know. I think there's something interesting there.
Yeah, I hadn't necessarily explicitly thought about that, but I think that is interesting. If nobody has a question, I have a question for Miriam and Baker, but I really want to prioritize other people's questions if I missed any. Well, so I loved reading both of these books, and I so appreciate your attention to space and place and geography. And I guess what I wanted to ask you is, and you can correct me, I feel like I see a kind of tension emerging where in some ways, and you know, Miriam, you talk a lot about this, that people shore up these stereotypes about quote unquote the rural redneck or quote unquote the bigoted South, that are unfair and don't really capture the whole story, especially since so many of the people you're interviewing are in these places and are living lives. But on the same rate, you also talk about how these spaces are actually very legitimately potentially unsafe or violent spaces. And I guess I'm wondering how we might teach the tensions of those wanting to resist the stereotypes while attending to areas that do frankly sometimes feel more unsafe or violent or risky, especially to our students whose you know perspectives we want to get just right. How do we handle that tension?
That's a great question, and I may answer it in sort of a sideways way, but I think the key is really focusing on like what is the ideological work that our narratives about particular spaces do. So like what's the work that our narratives about the South, about rural places. I'm doing research now in Idaho, and what, so I think there's some work that is important to do in terms of like upsetting those narratives, right? And sharing the examples of people that are like trans people or queer people that are living just fine in rural places, whether they're, out or not. And what sort of characteristics of rural communities do that. And then I think the thing that I tend to be more interested in is, how then do these fears like shape our behaviors in those places, right? So one, we excuse violence that might happen in rural places or the South. I mean this in a very larger sense, right? These are sort of culturally excused. Well, of course that's going to happen there. Of course, Matthew Shepard is going to be killed in Wyoming or Brandon Teena in Nebraska, right? Yeah, of course that's going to happen there. So we excuse it. And then we really turn away from the kind of violence that we see happening in these major cities that are supposed to be queer and trans havens, right? I mean, there were attacks on queer people in the streets of Portland over the last couple of years, right? But you don't do that. Portland is like a queer mecca, right? You don't hear about that as much. So again, I think it's about like, what are we doing? So answering your question in a sideways way, what are we doing with these narratives that don't allow us to see the things that are happening perhaps in front of us and allow us to excuse things that do happen in those spaces?
Yeah, too. I think this is hard, and I think this is an important question more broadly than this topic, is teaching our students that duality exists, right? That duality can exist. Things aren't black and white, and that's what we're always trying to teach our students. And in this case, so because I'm writing this chapter, it's for a book called Deviant Hollers that's going to come out about queers in Appalachia. And I've read a lot of Appalachian studies and seeing a lot of the same. I mean, obviously, Appalachia is largely in the South, in the southern region, what I consider the southeastern region, not all of it. But trying to do that duality, and I've read a lot of stories of people talking about how they don't tell stories of their own families because they don't want to fulfill the stereotypes. Stereotypes are there for a reason, though. I mean, they're based in some reality. So how do we teach students that stereotypes can have some reality while also there are also other things that have reality? So that's why I often use the term as I want to complicate the narrative of the South rather than overturn it. The narrative of the South is true in some ways, but it's way more nuanced and complicated than we have learned it. And so in my story, I write about how my family deals with addiction and obesity and all the problems that are stereotypes of the South, but that doesn't mean that I don't feel like a Southerner and I don't want to be here. So you can have both of these at the same time. You can have the problems and the good things at the same time. And like what Miriam was saying, it's also like the duality of violence in urban areas, right? We don't want to turn around and say, well, yeah, queer people get hurt in the South, but they get hurt more in the urban areas because then we might be supporting a bad narrative about race or something. So it's teaching our students to understand that the city can be violent because there's more people there, and it can be more violent than the South. But the South is still dangerous. It's not what I'm trying to say. I'm not trying to say that trans people have it easy in the South. But then personally, in this chapter, I'm writing about how I prefer the South because I understand the danger, and that's kind of what Miriam talks about with mapping geographies of fear. I know the map of my geography of fear living in South Carolina and Georgia. I can understand it. Whereas in urban areas, I don't understand it. I have no map to understand it. So I fear in both places, but I understand my fear. And so helping students, I think, understand that as well, is that these can both be true at the same time is really important. I don't know if that exactly answers, but I that duality is super important and what we all need to focus on. Complicating narratives rather than trying to say they're untrue, because obviously there's violence and there's rednecks and there's hate and racism in the South, but there's also queerness and there's also cool people and there's also all these other cool things in the South.
Thank you.
Any other questions that folks want to ask?
I have one if there's no one else that wants to come forward. I'm really interested in this idea, and that came up in both of your work, and just speak to even in kind of a wondering way of what's sort of happening with, I saw this a little bit in my interviews and talk about it, I think a little bit in my book, but I'm thinking about the future of trans politics and of a critical trans politics when fewer trans folks as young people are maybe sort of coming through queer and feminist communities. And I'm just really, I don't know. I kind of have that broader question. I don't think as Baker's work shows for sure that those are necessarily, lead to having a critical kind of politics, but I don't know, what kinds of changes do you all see coming up on the horizon?
Well, Miriam, in some ways, this is like the $1 million question in my world, because, and other books and scholarship have encountered this very dynamic, as many of my interviewees and the advocates I spoke with said, a lot of the kiddos in my world are not growing up trans, if you will. They're growing up boys and girls, and do not necessarily resonate with a transgender politic or community or history. As one advocate put in the book, it's like, are we detransgendering them in a way where this is such a normalized experience? And in one hand, you know, it should be, right? Because trans was partly a bridge away from something that was wrong and flawed in the first place. And so in some ways, it's great that these children aren't being held to that. But in other ways, I don't know how to answer your question. I mean, I know that it is a question that has presented itself in very real ways. And moreover, you know, my question is, do these kids do they owe us some queer or trans consciousness or politicized consciousness? And by the way, I don't at all mean to erase non-binary and gender fluid childhood realities. Those exist, but in some ways it didn't in ways that rocked the parents I studied. But for those kids who are often adamantly binary identified, for whom, you know, transgender doesn't even really resonate, I think it's interesting to think about how, you know, if we do want to center kids' voices, is trans an adult construct that is being applied to them by the adults in their lives? And how do they, you know, what do the children say about these schemas? So that's kind of, yes, a wondering response to your question, you know, but I think in some ways in my world, it's kind of, yes, this is clearly, there's clearly a disconnect happening, and what does it mean, and how much should it be addressed or not for specifically young children?
Yeah, a lot of the men I spoke to wanted to be seen as cis men. They didn't want to be in queer community. But a lot of them at certain times needed queer community, and I think the threat is it's not going to be there. I think we see this threat with lesbianism, right? Where the hell are the lesbians? Well, they're so normalized sitting at home with their kids that we can't even find them anymore. And it's so hard to find community, and I think that is tragic and a problem that we're gonna. So I think there is this like pro of normalizing things to a point where lesbians don't even need their own bars anymore. I wish we still had them, but it seems like we don't need them since they're almost all gone. There's like 5 left in the country, or 2 left in the Southeast. So it's like we don't need our own spaces, but sometimes I do need that space. So I wonder why we can still have these spaces of like race spaces, right? Spaces where it's only Black people or Hispanic people, but yet this idea of still having lesbian spaces or trans spaces has become like this idea of we don't need that. We can just be normal. I mean, I don't want to be normal. Some people want to be normal, but I need that community, and I fear where it's going. And I've written some about that. And actually, the next project I'm kind of thinking about is this like question of I don't think that this is true, but the disappearance of the lesbian, that people keep using this idea, right? And I think that that's kind of what we're seeing with what like Elizabeth is saying, the disappearance of the trans child, because they're just children now. And in some ways that's good, but the other ways we need community, and we need these community groups. And that's what the Black community has been telling us forever, is that although we all need to be living together in community, we also sometimes need our own spaces. And I think we're losing that, and that scares me. So I don't know, again, if that answers the questions, but it's scary that there's really very little queer space left, and most of that is white gay men, white gay cis man space left. So thinking about issues of place and space, I wonder if we really are succeeding by losing our place in space.
I'm going to go ahead and close it down a little bit. I will put all the information in the chat one last time. Again, thank you so much first to the SWS Book Salon Committee for creating this space for us to really think through these excellent works. And Elizabeth, Baker, and Miriam, your work is methodologically rich and theoretically is pushing forward all these different areas within gender, but also I think the other areas that you're also working within. So thank you so much for offering your perspectives and your thoughtful, deliberative comments and reflections. So thank you.